On this episode of Watch Stuff With Us, we got another MrBallen video. Thanks for checking out another MrBallen video with yours truly here at Watch Stuff With Us. I'm JD.
I'm Katie.
And please, we say it at the beginning of every video, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, do all that stuff. Hit that notification bell because in 2025, we will be live all the time. And you don't want to miss out on those things, do you?
Not all the time.
All the time. Don't listen to what she's saying.
A lot of the time?
Nope. All the time. So.
Not all the time.
MrBallen is something that we've done a whole bunch of videos about. See, I'm just ignoring that. MrBallen is a bunch of videos. We have done them and reacted to them, and we got another one for you today. This one is entitled Last Wish. So let's get started on the reaction.
Ooh.
A little after 3 p.m. on March 22nd, 1959, a 20-year-old British college student named Neil Moss stood in a cavern about 1,000 feet underground in northern England. And as he stood there, he was staring with excitement into this dark hole right in front of him. The cavern that Neil was standing inside of was known as Peak Cavern, and it was one of...
Okay, first off, Peak Cavern, not going in. We have caves around here, and there is no way that I'm ever going to do that. Like, some people like to go through and explore those caves and stuff and squeeze through those tight spaces. Not going to happen.
That picture made it look like straight up chitlins.
Going
into the chitlins, where you'll find some chitlins.
One of the biggest and most twisting cave systems in the entire country. In fact, it was so big that at one point, an entire village of 30 rope makers lived inside of this cave. And then also, after those rope makers, the cave system became a hideout for criminals and thieves because there were so many secret passageways and basically places to hide inside of the system.
And that means if something happens, nobody will be able to find
Peak Cavern was a pretty famous place. And as a result, basically all of it had been mapped out or at least explored by scientists and spelunkers, except for this hole right in front of Neil. It was an entrance to a tunnel that nobody even knew about. Neil and the amateur exploration group that he was a part of had discovered this entryway about 2 weeks earlier. Now, neither Neil nor anybody else in this group had actually gone into this hole yet. And the reason for that was it was pretty dangerous. I mean, the opening to this tunnel was pretty small. It was 1.5 feet by 2 feet wide at the opening.
We already know.
And just looking down into it, I mean, it's a dark hole that you really can't tell how tight or how far it even goes. And so once you went inside of it, you know, the deeper you got, the higher the risk of entrapment. And so whoever actually went into this hole really needed to be prepared. But Neil and the rest of his amateur exploration group really felt like it would be worth it to try to go down this tunnel. Not just because nobody had done it before, but specifically, they thought there was a chance that...
Haven't you done these, like, cave exploration things before?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I've done a couple of them, but they weren't... One was, like, a guided one, and it was Tom Sawyer's cave, so... Which is actually really, really cool, but it wasn't, like, anything where I had to dip down and get lost. There were some crazy stories though, but yeah, the other one was just Makokata Caves. I've been in there. That one was pretty cool. But yeah, I could see how somebody would get lost in there.
Nope, they had a cave that we took some kids to explore, and the first thing that the person, yes, for work.
Okay.
The first thing that the person who told us, who was like our guide, said, they were like, okay, well, when you go in, it's like really tight. But then if you move like another 20 feet, it opens up wide and you'll be able to walk around. As soon as I said that it was tight, I was like, nope, not going. Not going. Because I would be that one. Like somehow, some way. I'm not a small dude. But even if it was big enough for me, I would be that one person that would somehow, some way
like
get
just
stuck.
Turn a little bit wrong,
right?
And
something,
be like, I'm
something,
trapped.
Or like, you know, be going through and like my chain fell off, or I'll drop my keys somehow, and I bend over to get it. Oh, now I'm stuck.
You're like stuck like Pooh Bear in Rabbit's Hole, just like, eh, just the head coming out the butt.
Pooh Bear in Rabbit's Hole. Yep. That would be me, and I'm not. No way. There's no way. Never do it. Never do it. We'll never do it. So this story does not apply to me. I'm gonna look at it and watch it and react to it because it will never happen to me.
So what are you doing next weekend?
Beyond this tunnel, basically deep underground, if you followed it long enough, it could lead to another big open chamber that nobody had found before.
It opens up.
And those types
up.
of big open chambers, whoever finds them gets it named after them. And so Neil and his group were thinking, hey, if we find this big chamber, it'll be named after us. We'll be famous, at least in, spelunking circles. But they also understood that there might be nothing at the other end of this tunnel. It could just be a dead end. But the only way to know for sure would be if one of the members of this group went into the hole. Now, in addition to a fear of being trapped in the hole, there were other big issues with blindly crawling into a tunnel no one's been in before. Like, for example, there could be a sudden drop-off, or running water, or some other hazard that whoever went into the hole wouldn't know about until they were facing it. And so naturally, everybody in this group was excited about the hole, but also a little apprehensive about being the guinea pig to actually go into the hole. And so after the group had kind of stood around the hole for a minute, kind of talking through who was going to do it, Neil had finally courageously volunteered to be the guinea pig. He would go down. And in many ways, Neil was kind of like the perfect candidate for this job. He was smart, he was strong, and most importantly, he was thin, which meant he could navigate a really tight space. The only drawback to Neil was he was pretty tall. He was over 6 feet. And generally speaking, the best cavers in the world are very short and thin because it allows them to get into the smallest, tightest spaces underground. And so Neil, who was standing over the hole, began to mentally prepare himself for what he was about to do. He pulled out his flashlight and he shined it straight down into this hole, which again is a pretty narrow hole, and it basically went straight down. And as he was shining it, he saw about 12 feet down, the hole kind of turned and you couldn't see what was beyond it. And so Neil knew the only part of this trip he would know about is that first 12 feet. Once he made that turn, everything beyond that was totally unknown. Literally no one in the world knew what was beyond it. Neil was about to find out. The cave explorers anchored this 75-foot-long wire ladder that was all rolled up to this rock that was inside the cavern, right near the opening to this hole. Once that was in place, they spooled out the ladder and kind of dumped it down into the hole. And so it fell 12 feet down and landed right where this tunnel turned and sort of went into oblivion, where nobody knows what happened after that. And so Neil, his job was going to be to go into this hole feet first, go down 12 feet, and then with his feet, as he kind of blindly crawled backwards feet first into the tunnel, he'd be kicking with his feet this ladder, extending it farther and farther into this tunnel. The idea was this ladder was his way back out again. So he's basically on top of the ladder, making his way, and at any point he can just grab the ladder and climb back out again. And so once the ladder was in place and all the cave explorers were kind of waiting for Neil walked up to the edge of the hole, he took a deep breath, and then he swung one leg into the hole, placed it on one of the rungs of the ladder, put his other leg on the ladder as well, and kind of tested it to make sure the rock that was anchoring the ladder could hold his weight. Once he was sure it could, he said goodbye to the explorers and then began his descent, feet first, down into the hole. As Neil slowly and carefully climbed down the slide.
You're back right in time, but what do you think was like his reaction when he first went down into the hole? Like, do you think he was excited about this, or is this a situation where he was like, oh well, I guess I'll do it?
Or is it like a poop moment? Probably excited.
Yeah, I would think so. You don't expect this to be like your final moment or a situation where you're going to pass away at the end of it.
You just want to have like bragging rights and be excited that you were the first to go in there. It's named after you.
Yeah. Is it worth it though? Is it worth it?
I'm thinking not.
Ladder, during this first 12-foot section, he felt the walls of this hole closing in on him. When he was close to the bottom of this first section, the walls were literally flush with his shoulders and back. This was a really tight space. And so finally he got to the very bottom of this 12-foot section, and he was about to step onto what he thought was another rung, because he can't actually see where he's going. He's just using his feet to feel. And he stepped down, and he felt something hard. It was the ground. So he had reached the bottom of the 12-foot section. He kind of tested the ground with his foot, seeing if it would support his weight. And after feeling confident, he stepped off the ladder and just stood at the bottom of the hole. At this point, Neil used his feet to kick the ladder that was still coiled up at the bottom of the hole into the next turn, into the next section of the tunnel that he'd be going down. and as soon as he kicked it, he heard it kind of spool out as it tumbled down this next section. However, it was not a straight drop like this first section was. This next section he'd be going into was more of a gradual decline, just based on the sound this ladder was making as it tumbled down. And so after the ladder had stopped making noise and he knew it had stopped, Neil gave one final look up at his friends above, gave them a little wave, even though he could barely move his hands because it's so tight around him, and then he got down on his stomach and feet first began shimmying himself down into this next section. Now, during the first 12 feet and during the initial turn into this new section, Neil had been able to turn his head and basically look down and see where his feet were going. But after only a few feet of going into this new section, the walls had become so tight on his body that he couldn't even move his head. He really was blind and had no idea where he was going. Now, for a lot of people, this would have been a claustrophobic nightmare. Neil is in this unbelievably tight space. He has no idea what's going to happen next. He doesn't know if it's going to get so tight he'll get wedged in there. It's cold, it's damp, I mean, it's pitch black in there. He does have a headlamp, but his head is like kind of pressed to the ground and he can't really move it. So, he's not really able to look around him. And periodically, as he was shimmying his way down deeper into this tunnel, he would dislodge rocks from the wall and he would hear them strike the wall as they tumbled down into oblivion. He had no idea if these rocks were tumbling into a dead end or if they were tumbling off a ledge somewhere, a ledge that he wouldn't be aware of until he got to it. But for Neil, this environment was something he thrived in. It was why he was so drawn to cave exploration. As much as cave exploring was a physical exercise and a physical test, it was much more a mental test. I mean, can you handle being in these tight spaces and persevering and continuing on when you're all by yourself and it's like dangers all around you? And also, Neil just loved being alone and in the dark. So cave exploration was like
being alone and in the dark.
When Neil had made it about 10 feet down this new section, his feet touched the rolled up section of the ladder. And so with his toes, he kind of gave it a kick and the ladder tumbled for a second and he could hear it. And then it just kind of vanished altogether, like the ladder had gone over a cliff. And so Neil realized, very likely, just beyond his feet, even though he cannot see it, is a ledge, and very likely either a drop-off or a new cavern. The thing they hope is on the other end of this tunnel. And so this was exciting for Neil. He felt a rush of adrenaline. There's a new turn in the tunnel, and for all he knows, this is the cavern they're looking for. Or it's just another section of tunnel he would have to explore. But either way, he's making progress. And so Neil very carefully scooched backwards until he felt the edge, at which point he let his legs go over the edge. He found his footing on the ladder. And it was at this point, when he kind of turned around a little bit, that he could see this was not some big open cavern he had found. It was just a turn in the tunnel system. It was now going back to basically a vertical hole, big enough to fit inside of, but Neil has no idea how deep it goes or what it leads to. But Neil was totally undeterred. He lowered his whole body into the section, got on the ladder, and began descending. And very quickly, as he began this descent, the walls of this section, this new vertical section, were so tight, it was about 18 inches in diameter, that he actually couldn't just go straight down. His body didn't fit just trying to maneuver down. So the only way he could get himself to go down further was to shimmy himself side to side like a corkscrew, basically force...
Nope. You're
not gonna turn and shimmy and hope for the
No,
best?
like you're forcing your way into something. It's like those kids that you see when they have their head stuck between the railing. Yes, It's like you have to turn your head a certain way to force yourself into there. Mm-hmm. The second he's forcing,
yeah.
No, just no.
Forcing his body deeper and deeper into this hole. And so Neil continued doing this for an additional 18 feet down in this new section of tunnel, which put him at a total of 40 feet down into this tunnel from the entrance where the rest of his friends were. And when he got down there, 18 feet down, he went to step onto the rung to continue his descent, but his foot hit rock. And he felt around with his feet, and he realized this tunnel did not lead to a big new chamber. It instead was a dead end after all. Now, just to be sure, Neil actually kicked as hard as he could. He's kind of restricted, but he kicked with his legs as much as he could to see if maybe this wasn't a true dead end. Maybe it was just an obstruction and he could clear it. But he could tell, after a few stomps, This was not moving. This really was the end. Now, part of Neil was disappointed because he was hoping that by doing this, they would discover this big new chamber and they'd get it named after them. But on the other hand, he was also relieved because by this point, it was extremely claustrophobic, even for a guy who thrived in this environment. You know, by the bottom of this 40-foot section, he is completely wedged in place. And so Neil decided it was time to head back to the surface. But from where he was at, he couldn't even hear his friends. He's way down deep in this tunnel. It's totally pitch black. And so what he needed to do was just begin climbing back up this ladder. And then, about halfway up, he could call up to his friends and tell them, hey, I'm returning. But remember, to get to where Neil is, he has literally forced his body down into this tiny hole, basically corkscrewing himself as deep as he could get. And so he's totally restricted, and his arms are basically by his side, and his hands are basically pinned in front of his body. And so Neil tried to grab the ladder, which is literally pressed up against his chest, to begin the ascent, but even though his fingers could touch the rungs of the ladder, he couldn't actually move his arms to pull himself up the ladder. He could just hold the rung. That was it. But
I don't know if anybody else that's watching this with us or you feel this way, but it gives me anxiety, just listening to this story and listening to how this is turning out. I'm anxious watching this right now.
Yeah, I would not enjoy being in that situation whatsoever. Not with me already having anxiety. Send me in there. I'll be great, I'm sure.
Right? That'll be awesome.
But Neil had been in similar situations before, and what you do is you just use your legs. You drive with your legs and push your body up until your arms can go above your head, and then you continue the ascent. However, his legs also were basically in the same situation. It was so unbelievably tight around his legs that he couldn't lift his legs up. He could just basically wiggle his feet. Basically, there was no way physically for Neil to get himself out. He would need his team up above to pull him out. And so Neil began shouting as loud as he could, trying to get the attention of his friends up above, telling them, hey, I'm stuck, pull me out. And then also, as best as he could with his hands on the rung, he kind of pulled on the ladder, signaling to them, hey, get me out of here. Now, he couldn't really hear anything up above. It was sort of muffled, and he couldn't tell if they were yelling back down to him. But as he was holding onto the ladder, he felt a little bit of tension, suggesting they were pulling on him. However, as he held on, waiting to be pulled up and out, he didn't budge. Despite the tension on this ladder clearly coming from the surface from his friends, he wasn't moving. And that's when Neil realized he had made a critical mistake. When he had reached the bottom of this tunnel, when he realized it was a dead end, he had stomped with his feet to confirm it really was a dead end. And when he had done that, he had inadvertently kicked the rungs of this ladder into a crevice, and then rocks, which he had heard kind of falling when he was kicking, landed on top of it, basically pinning the ladder in place. Basically, this ladder was now anchored inside the cave, which meant no matter how hard his friends on the surface pulled, they would not be able to pull the ladder up, which meant they couldn't pull Neil up. And Neil, once he realized this was the issue, he tried to move his feet to clear the rocks off the bottom of the ladder, but he couldn't. It was too tight around him. And so, Neil was totally stuck.
Wait a couple days.
As many of you may know,
He'll be okay in a couple days. Take a big poop. And then don't eat anything, don't drink anything, not like he could.
Right? He ain't getting nothing anyway.
You'll slim a little bit.
The members of Neil's exploration group pretty much immediately realized this was a crisis. Because not only was Neil stuck in this cave, but in these tight little tunnels underground, there's limited oxygen. So it's not just a matter of, we'll figure it out and get Neil out somehow. It's no, you have a limited amount of time before Neil runs out of oxygen down there. Even if you come up with a solution, it might be too late. And so immediately, members of the exploration group left Peak Cavern to go get help. And before long, over 200 people had flooded the cavern, including a mountain rescue unit and a coal mining extraction team and a whole bunch of civilians who were all there to try to figure out how to get Neil out. Now, at first, Neil was very
don't know.
optimistic
They
about
might
his
have
recovery.
newspapers,
He could
but,
hear
they don't
clearly
have
all the
cameras or
commotion
anything, so
40
it's
feet
just
above him. He couldn't
go
fully
door to door.
discern what was going on
Peace
there,
out.
but he could clearly tell a major rescue operation was afoot. And so as ropes were cast down and ladders were cast down to try to get him out, and they continued to fail, and as the air he was breathing began to thin out and it was getting harder to breathe, Neil's reaction was to kind of be positive. He actually began cracking jokes and calling up like, hey, how much longer do I have to wait down here? But as the minutes turned into hours and none of the efforts by any of the rescuers were working, Neil began to panic. His heart was racing, not only from his nerves, but also because he was running out of oxygen. He had begun to grit his teeth really hard to kind of control his fear, but he was really starting to lose it. At one point, the rescuers threw down an oxygen mask for him to breathe because it was clear the air was becoming a real issue. But even though the mask literally tumbled down and hit him right on the head, so it's right here, he couldn't get his arms up to put the mask on. And so there it is, salvation, but he couldn't use it. And so before long, Neil sort of began drifting in and out of consciousness. One moment he'd be calling up to his rescuers, asking for an update. The next, they'd call down to him and get no response. Clearly, this situation was becoming dire. Now, to this point, the way the rescue had gone was the rescuers were basically throwing equipment into the hole, be it ladders or ropes or oxygen masks for Neil to grab onto or put on him, and they were hoping that basically Neil could get himself out of the hole. Because the great fear was, if we send a rescuer, or rescuers plural, into this hole to get him, they could get stuck, and now we have an even bigger problem. But when Neil began losing consciousness, when they couldn't get him to call back to them, they knew they were genuinely running out of time. And so they began pumping oxygen into the hole to hopefully buy some extra time. And then they decided, we gotta send someone into the hole. Someone has to go in there, get Neil, and pull him out. And so one by one, these courageous rescuers went down into the hole,
That guy in the back shouldn't
and
be going.
8 times they tried, and 8 times they failed. All 8 either
Send a
got
small
stuck along the
child.
way or they passed out along the way. 3 people actually
they
reached
fell.
Neil and actually touched Neil, but there was no way to grab him and pull him out. And so Neil, who was conscious for a lot of
you need,
this,
like, a little
like
person.
he's hearing
At
and
least they're
literally in
adults.
some cases seeing
But they're small like
rescue.
a
It's
child.
right there. It's right in front of him.
True,
But it
I
just
don't think
didn't
they're on,
work.
standby.
By the time the 8th man was pulled back out of the
You're gonna
hole,
ring this town
they could
bell
hear
and,
in the
"Oh, it's
hole
my
this
turn."
horrible sound, which was Neil gasping for air. Even though they were attempting to pump air into this hole, it wasn't enough, and Neil just couldn't fill his lungs with enough oxygen. And so the rescuers yelled into the hole for Neil to just hold on. They were gonna get him out of there. Just be strong, hold on. But by this point, Neil, he wasn't even saying anything back. He just continued making these awful gasping sounds. By about 7 p.m., when Neil had been stuck in this hole for 4 hours, the rescuers decided to send one more guy into this hole, this really small civilian. And he went down there with a rope to attach around Neil and hopefully pull him out. And this little civilian managed to get
That's
all
how
the
they
way
say small
down,
child.
all the way to Neil. And when he found Neil, Neil was unconscious, but alive. And the rescuer put the rope around Neil's shoulders and then signaled to the surface to begin pulling. And so from the surface, they pulled on this rope, and slowly but surely, Neil began to be pulled out of the hole. And he moved about 18 inches, being monitored by the civilian who was down there. However, because they were pulling so hard on this rope to get Neil to move, the pressure from that rope was basically crushing Neil's chest, and he stopped breathing. And the civilian who was down there with Neil noticed it and yelled up to the group to stop. And they had to take the rope off because, yeah, they might be able to pull him out this way, but they would kill him. He would suffocate. And so once the civilian rescuer came out of the hole, he told the group, like, look, Neil's body is simply too big to be yanked out of the hole safely. He needs to be conscious and able to contort and twist his body, basically undoing what Neil did to get down there in order to get out again. Like, we need his participation, and he's unconscious, so we can't do that. And so at this point, the rescuers were totally desperate. They know Neil is still alive. They can hear some of his ragged breathing coming out of the hole, but they knew they had to do something drastic right now or Neil was gonna die. And so they came up with this plan for this even smaller rescuer, this woman, to go down into the hole, get to Neil, and break his collarbone to try to shrink his body to be able to pull him out. And so this woman, she goes down there and she reaches Neil, but she failed to break his collarbone. And so she too had to come out of the
How
hole,
was she gonna break
leaving
it to
Neil
begin
behind.
with?
And so once the woman came out of the hole, it became clear to the rescuers that Neil was not getting out of this hole. even though he was just 40 feet away and at this moment still very much alive. They could hear his ragged breathing, but there was just nothing anybody could do. And so one of the rescuers called Neil's father and told him, "You need to come out to Peak Cavern." Not long after that, Neil's father, Eric Moss, arrived at Peak Cavern. Now, he knew going into this that his son was stuck. That's why he got the phone call to come out here. But he did not understand just how dire the situation really was. But as soon as he got to Peak Cavern and saw all these vehicles outside and the hundreds of rescuers coming in and out of the cave with these sad, dark expressions on their faces, Eric knew this was really bad. And so Eric made his way into Peak Cavern, and for hours he just hoped and prayed that whatever was happening would be enough to get his son out. And for hours, Eric just stood there in Peak Cavern, hoping to see his son emerge from the hole, hoping to come up and say everything is okay, but he didn't. And things only got worse. It eventually began to rain. And unfortunately, Peak Cavern, and specifically the hole that Neil was stuck inside of, flood when it rains. And so as rainwater is pouring into this cavern and
But will
Neil
the
is
rain
still
loosen
alive
anything?
but stuck in this hole, they had to make the heart-wrenching decision in front of Neil's father to abandon the operation and get out of the cave, knowing Neil was going to die. Rescuers were finally able to get back into Peak Cavern at about 3 a.m. on March 24th, which is approximately 36 hours after Neil got trapped. By this point, the rains had subsided, the flood had cleared, and so they went in there hoping for a miracle. And when they got to the hole and listened into it, they actually heard Neil still breathing. He was still alive, but it was very clear he was at the end of his life. And all they could do was just sit around this hole and listen as Neil took his last few final ragged breaths. And then eventually they listened as Neil took his final breath and the hole went silent. Now, at this point, it was too dangerous to send anybody back down into this hole, and so no one could get physically close enough to Neil to actually confirm that he really is dead. However, after the hole remained silent for quite a while, a doctor who was on site did walk over and declare Neil dead. And so at this point, the rescue operation became a recovery operation. However, as rescuers were getting ready to go back down into the hole to retrieve Neil's body, it was at this point that Neil's father, Eric Moss, who had been there this whole time and had been witness to the doctor declaring his son dead, it was at this point that he stepped in and said, "Stop, get everybody out of the cave. I don't want anybody else to lose their lives." And so ultimately, Eric made the decision to leave his son's body where it was. Eventually, once it was 100% certain that Neil really must be dead at this point, they would fill in the hole that Neil had climbed down inside of with loose rocks from the cave, entombing him inside of it forever. And in his memory, the tunnel that Neil died inside of was named after him. It's called Moss Chamber.
Dude, that's super morbid. Like, I want to make a joke because, like, I mean, he wanted something named after him, and he got it. But man, that yeah, I don't think that's. I'm sure that's not the way he wanted that to turn out. But yeah,
I don't even really have words. Like,
yeah, I mean,
like, that sucks. I don't know what else to say. That sucks.
Yeah. And I mean, he was, at least you can say that he lost his life doing something that he obviously loved. I feel like there were a bunch of somebody, I don't know if there's anything that he could have done or anyone could have done to mitigate the problem that eventually happened. Like, if he went down there, especially at that point in time during, in history, there was nothing. If something goes wrong, there's nothing that you can do about it. Like, it's just a wrap. And I felt like, he might have enjoyed that type of thing, but man, maybe you need to pick another hobby. Like, this is why I'm not going in a cave. No, because that would be me. They'd be calling it JD Cave. And I'd be trying to stream from down there because once I got stuck, it wouldn't be no way that I'd come back up.
Now we can send a drone after you.
Well, I don't know if you can send it. Like, what is the drone gonna do?
Bring supplies.
Maybe, but I mean, like the way, and then too, like the way he was caught and the way he was like in praying mantis form Like he couldn't like. How? Not to make light of a.
No, but he's stuck. He needs some Vaseline.
He needs a whole bunch of stuff, and whatever he had did not help.
Olive oil and Vaseline.
Yeah, it didn't help. Too bad for him, man.
I was really hopeful with the rain. I figured that would make it at least slick enough that he could maybe get a little bit. But even, I guess he had been down there for so long,
and then
that maybe he didn't have any strength left.
And then too, like it's digging. Like it's not like these are smooth rocks. Like that's got to be like digging into his flesh.
Oh yeah.
Like oh man, that's just a bad way to go.
That is a long time to die too.
Right, and they said he was 36 hours. They came back thinking that he was already gone, and he wasn't.
Trying to breathe.
And he was still trying to breathe, dude. Like, yeah, that's rough. That's a bad way to go. What isn't a bad way to go is by hitting that like button and hitting the subscribe button and also that notification bell, because when you do that, you can be notified each and every time we go live or post a video or a short or anything. And I guarantee you one thing, if you watch one of our videos, it will not entomb you in a rock grave. I guarantee you that.
No.
Unless you decide to go spelunking while watching us on a video. And if you decide to do that, man, so be it. Best of luck to you.
How
I really hope.
Reception?
Yeah, I don't know, but thanks for watching. I really appreciate it.
Yes. Leave a comment. Let us know what you thought about the video.
Yeah. Let us know what you would have done.
If you had words at the end.
Would you do this?
Does this sound like a really good time?
Not to me.
Me either.
I'm JD.
I'm Katie.
Thanks for tuning in to another awesome episode of Watch Stuff with us. We'll see you when we see you.
Bye.
Peace.